have other people joining us as well.
Maybe we can bring John onto our board.
Is that what this is? That's a hostile takeover by kidnapping the board chair of another. Yeah, I like that. It's good.
It's all part of our negotiation for the music teacher. You're like,
it's very. All right, we're streaming now. So let's see.
We don't have a quorum, John.
We do not have a quorum, do we? Well, we're still streaming, so everyone stay appropriate.
What constitutes a quorum?
3 or more members of the Joint Policy Committee.
Oh.
I thought you were going to ask what constitutes appropriate.
Yeah, I thought so too.
It's a whole separate question.
That's what caught me. That's what caught me off guard.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay. I actually do.
Hey, John, I'm going to disconnect and dial in. I apologize.
Okay, no worries. I do remember seeing something from Gwen that said she might not be able to make it tonight. So I think we're just waiting for my brain to work for Maureen.
Is there an actual ER9 policy committee that's been formed and has a charge?
Yes, we did that.
I want to say last May.
Yeah, it was. I think it was a year ago, May.
Where is that information? Because I didn't see it anywhere on our website anywhere. So.
What we don't have charges clearly.
Well,
clearly
no, you don't even have
websites.
it. It has the committee, but it doesn't. It's not listed under, each board has their own policy committee. I thought you were all meeting jointly to do common work. I didn't know whether there was a formal committee formed with all 3 making one.
We did. Yeah, that's that. I think Chris is right. It was May that we did that last year, but we did that last year. So I don't know. We could go back into the minutes and stuff. And
I think that all the joint meetings are filed under Region 9, because I know the minutes for the DEI task force are filed on the website under Region 9.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I was looking on the Region 9. But.
Yeah, and I've actually had there's been weird stuff like DEI. I found some of the DEI stuff only on the Reading site in the past, so it has been somewhat confusing. And I know Dr. Harrison has a wish list item to look at different platforms for the website and see about making that a lot easier and cleaner. We have quorum. Hey, Maureen, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Hey, good.
Sorry I'm late.
No, not at all. I think we are all living insanely busy lives. So bear with me 1 second. I just want to make sure I have everything teed up here. And I have so many. Apologies. Go. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Thank you. So we'll call to order this special meeting of the Eastern Reading Region 9 Joint Boards of Education Policy Committees at 7:05 p.m. on April 22nd, 2021. Committee members in attendance, Chris Parkin, Maureen Williams, and myself, John Stinson. Not in attendance, Gwen Denny. And we'll start with public comment. I don't know if we have any members of the public here outside of our regular board members here in attendance. So I think we'll move on to committee member comment.
Just thank the folks from the boards who've come out tonight to participate in this conversation, which I think is going to be valuable and helpful to our work and the 3 boards' work going forward.
Yep. Agreed. Okay. We'll move into discussion and possible action. So item 4A, ER9 governance and mechanisms for resolving conflicts between the boards, shared employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many topics. I'm actually going to share my screen here and just go through, sort of use this presentation to sort of frame the conversation. So what we're hoping to do tonight is to discuss the governance process and best practices when it comes to the 3 separate boards getting together and making sure that when we get together that we're able to take those areas that where we have shared responsibility and a need to collaborate, making sure that we can be as efficient and effective and maximize the impact of our efforts when we, embark on those collaborations. We think of this in 3 major categories of items that we think are sort of make sense to talk about. So the big buckets are sort of joint meetings and joint committees, sort of whenever we're getting together, and the governance surrounding those meetings. We then think about matters impacting central office and shared personnel, so hiring, salary, negotiations, and things like that. And then we think about the methods for reaching consensus. And that is, if we don't agree on something, what is the process? Should there be a process? If there is one, let's just write it down. Overall, I think the theme that we're trying to get to here is, let's make sure that we have documented whatever the processes that we are advocating for, very similar to the way that we documented the what we thought was a good hiring process when we were sort of going to work together and sort of make a hire in central office of a senior person. We went through the process and we just said, here's what we think roughly that the timeline should look like, the sort of pieces should be, and this should happen, and then this should happen. The same idea here. Let's just document our thinking. It's not meant to be we lock it down, we've decided, and there's never going to be additional conversations. It is just meant to be, in emergency, break glass here. So when these things happen, what is the prescribed process? Anything, Chris or Maureen, that you'd want to add to that statement before we move on?
Only that we spent a great deal of time, we, the committee, thinking about the things we needed to think about from the ceiling level view. And this was the basic framework that we started with when we started thinking.
Yep.
I think we all share the view that it's important to have something from which to use as a reference moving forward, and that can evolve over time as we learn how to refine these processes.
Yep.
And we are here just providing the framework and seeking and wanting input from other people. We have just tried to frame the discussion and then fill in some of the blanks with what we thought, but none of us are bound and determined to any particular mechanism or way of thinking. We just wanted to frame the discussion for everyone so that we could come to some resolution.
Yeah, agreed. Just before we dive in, and I hope this can be an interactive and sort of fulsome discussion, we think it's worthwhile just to point out some of the benefits to acting now. So first, we're not in the midst of a live controversy. I think we're not currently in disagreement, and I think it's certainly helpful for us to sort of operate within, inside of a place where we're all getting along and all of that. Not to say that we're bound to get there, but it helps. We have new senior leaders in central office right now, and I think we're about to hire another one, and I think it's really important that that they can benefit from that. I think it's fair to say that we have an obligation to future members. It is, I think, a little unfair to a new member to say, figure it out, or even if we have one member who sort of puts their arm around them and says, hey, let me tell you, here's how this works, here's how this works. And even documenting it for that one member who's going to help orient new members. It's just important that we're able to give them something that says, here is the process. We also have a lot to do when it comes to COVID, right? And we know that we're going to be working through some challenges next year to recover and sort of get everything back on track. And we want to reduce any sort of friction that might come from sort of process disagreements or anything like that. And we also have some time. It's April 22nd. It's not until May 25th that we have the next meeting of the boards jointly. And when we do that, we hope that we can come back with a really good set of recommendations that's based on feedback and sort of input that we're getting from our board members. Okay. All right. So category number one, joint meetings and joint committee governance. The goal here is document the standard operating procedures for joint meetings, joint committee governance to improve overall efficiency. What we think of as the scope for this are these, 6 items. And we certainly, are open to the idea that there could be additional items here that we're not thinking of. But for instance, how is the chair selected? We think we have a pretty good process that everyone sort of is already understands and is operating under. We just want to make sure it's documented. Setting an agenda, recording minutes, defining committee charges, acting on committee recommendations, acting on contracts. And there could be other items. If anyone has ideas right now that we should add here, happy to hear those, and we'll make sure that that's sort of a part of our discussions in the future. As an example of just sort of documenting the chair selection, we think that an accurate reflection of the current way that the chair is selected for when meetings are happening amongst the 3 boards, the chairs of each board take turns serving as the chair of joint meetings according to an annual rotation set to the calendar year. The current rotation following Region 9 2020, Reading 2021, Easton 2022, Region 9 again 2023, and so on. So I'll pause here. Anyone have any questions or thoughts, comments, concerns about anything we've laid out so far, or anything specific to this slide?
Does the word acting on contracts, does acting include creation or establishing terms, or for me that bullet should just be contracts, because there's so many facets to it, and I don't know if acting for some reason is directing my attention to like something that's already created.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you mean the whole of contracts, right?
Yeah, the entire contract, sort of when we have a contract that affects all 3 boards, like what does that look like? Like what is that process overall, not just the part where we vote on yay or nay to the contract?
Right. I can think of times in tri-board or tri-board settings that like it's a little bit like uneasy or uncomfortable because there's a disagreement in how the terms of the contract were reached. And so just that the committee would include the whole contract process as much as we are a part of it.
Okay. I think that's good feedback. Anyone else have thoughts about that or anything else?
I'm confused about, it seems like we're merging 2 separate items here, joint meeting and then joint committee governance. Again, when we talk about joint meetings, I'm still of the opinion, as is legal, which is we are 3 separate boards meeting together, right? Holding 3 separate meetings, but with a common agenda and common goals.
Yep. So
the chair rotation is currently happening. If you want to write down somewhere whose turn it is, on which years or something, I think that's a good idea. I mean, but it's certainly already been going on. When you say setting the agenda, and again, these are things that you're proposing that get discussed to iron out, or because there's some confusion as to who sets the agenda. Is it, again, I would be of the opinion that it's 3 separate meetings, so all 3 board chairs should have input as to the agenda. I would feel the minutes get recorded, but then there's separate things there when you go on defining a committee charge, acting on committee recommendation. Those are separate joint committees, and so again, I would say that they also need to select the chair, I guess, but defining the committee charge would be the role of the boards.
I think, Mike, all we're trying to do is sort of codify procedure, right? It was the consensus of the policy group generally that we have some rules floating around there, that they're not well codified. At least we don't believe they're well codified, and that we could streamline them and we could eliminate the ways in which conflict could possibly develop by codifying them. And I think John and Chris would probably agree with just what I said. It's not like we don't agree that that's the procedure for selecting a chair, but if we codify it, then future board members will know that that's the procedure, and we won't look to any particular person to say, but this is how we do it, right? It's sort of like the difference between codifying something and having norms, right? Like in a family structure, for example, you would have norms. That's the way this family does it. But in a business, and we're much more like a business, they codify policies and procedures. And that's kind of what we're trying to do.
So you just want to.
We want to codify it. We want to know what it is for the benefit of everyone else, as well as ourselves.
And I think a good example, Mike, is before the meeting convened, you would ask a question about the charge of this committee and whether or not there is a joint committee. And that sort of gets at the core of this, which is what is the process that should be followed to create and charge a committee? At what interval should that be reviewed and re-upped and things of that nature? And by creating, more or less a handbook on process, it allows future board members to understand what the way of doing that is. And there's no perfect way to do it. And there might not even be a wrong way to do it, but there should be a way to do it. And that allows us all to sort of know what to expect and how to go about doing these things.
But there's an established process, and it's not really even up for discussion, which is that, when the cycle changes and you have the election year and you change the chair, then you name new committees, all that stuff is pretty much set. You just want to write it down unless you're looking to change it.
Yeah, no, I don't think that we're looking to change it. I think I think across the board, I can't think of it a single instance where we're thinking, oh, we really should change this. I think in each instance, it's just, we really should document this. Let's make it crystal clear what the process is.
So where would this go? As we're talking like an operating manual or a handbook, because there's no policy on this. And I agree, it's probably a good idea to say, this is the practice. We're all in agreement with the practice of how the chair works. Right. It rotates. These are the years. Yep. Where do we put that? Are we creating a new policy or creating a handbook? Or
I think it's I think it's a function of almost like we've been working, I think everybody knows, we've been working to try to go through all the CABE policies and make recommendations. And, we have thought of a sort of section at the very beginning of that manual that will be, or that policy book that says, hey, we're kind of special. All the policies you see in here are policies that kind of relate to the sort of the individual districts and in sort of how we're carrying out, these various, sort of matters of law and our policies to make sure that we're adhering to those. But we're special because we are 3 boards who collaborate on a set of some things. And in that sense, here's how we will function. So I think it's just sort of attached to that. I don't know that it's necessarily policy that is, first reading, second reading policy, as much as it is just like the hiring process that we defined before. It is, we are establishing the norms, documenting what the norms are now. And if there's ever a time when we need to deviate from that, I think we have the flexibility to do that. should know that, oh, this isn't the way that we've done it or the way that we've agreed to do it.
To me, it's closer to a memorandum of understanding between the three boards than a policy that any of the three boards are enacting or bylaws that any of the three boards are enacting. It's basically, to Mike's point, we're three boards that have agreed to sit down and meet together at least 3 times a year for the greater efficiency of all 3 districts. And we have, as part of that agreement, we're now documenting the agreement to do that. And here's how we're going to work together when we do work together.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, we've been passing the knowledge on by word of mouth, right? Board member to board member. So it makes sense to put it someplace, right? If it's
we all know that that's not a good business practice, right?
Yeah.
So
right. Okay. All right, good.
So it is in our bylaws, I think, just so you know.
The joint operations in the bylaws?
No, not the joint ones, but the operations. In other words, it tells you in the bylaws, you elect the chair.
That's right.
And the bylaws, everything is spelled out.
Right.
But we can't do bylaws for the 3 boards.
And that's and it's funny you say that, because that's actually, as we go through the CABE policy, the 9,000 series is the bylaws section. And we've always said, that's not, we're not really going to do that. The joint committee is not going to come up with, Easton, your bylaws will be this, Reading, your bylaws will be that. Like, no, the boards, we've said the boards will be individually responsible for their own bylaws. But this is kind of this is us talking about not bylaws for when we get together, but it's the same topics, right? It's the same topics you find under bylaws. Yeah. Okay. Anything else specific to, I think that's a really important and good general conversation. Is there anything else specific to joint meetings, joint committee governance that people would want to add to the scope? I think the note to, just make contracts a more sort of inclusive term. I think that's good.
What's acting on committee recommendations? Because anything that's done, right, the boards have to agree, and then the boards have to apply within their own districts. So,
right. So when we meet, we are 3 boards meeting as individual boards, but at the same time, right? So in those sessions, we could say, let's say that there's a recommendation of a joint committee, right? A joint committee making a recommendation. Should that recommendation come only inside of the 3 boards working together, or should that be the norm, that it's coming inside of one of our tri-board meetings? And if it is the intent, is the sort of intent of that gives us the opportunity to have conversations about this recommendation coming from a joint committee, whether it's, transportation or the policy committee or, sort of various committees that meet. And I think we have something like 5 or 6 joint committees. Is that right?
I think, to put it sort of a fine example on it for Todd, it's if the Joint Transportation Committee went out to bid for a bus contract and their recommendation was to pick Acme Bus Company, should it be the expectation that that recommendation be brought to the 3 boards sitting jointly to act upon? Or is it okay, or should it be expected that it be deliberated upon and discussed individually by the 3 boards? And I think there's sort of, in different circumstances, arguments for different outcomes on those recommendations.
And if it makes sense for there to be different outcomes, that there are good reasons for it to be either, then I think we just document that and we say, there are reasons that it could be this way, a reason could be the other way, and that's fine.
Yeah, well, I'm okay with, if a joint committee, we jointly work and figure out, here's the bus contract, here's the recommendation, each of the boards need to vote on it. And if one of the boards doesn't agree, you're not going to bind the other board to that decision. But having having anything from a joint committee come up in front of a joint meeting is fine and can be voted on by the 3 boards in that meeting. If they can't, then you could take it back to an individual board and vote on it. But we can't say, the other 2 override the others or anything like that. That's not going to work.
I'm thinking about it strictly from the quality of the conversation perspective, because if you take the bus contract in 3 separate meetings, you could have 3 very different conversations that land very differently.
Yeah. No, I think it makes sense to put it in a joint discussion there, and then each board makes it.
Right. So I think that
otherwise you got to do it like 3 different times. So it's kind
of in the context of acting on committee recommendations. Then the framework would be that there's a presumption or an expectation that joint committee recommendations are brought first to the board sitting jointly. or something to that effect.
Yeah, if feasible, right? But if timing, if we
Right.
can't get quorums or whatever. then
Well, and we just did
take it back.
this, right? Easton, took the recommendation from the policy committee related to Title IX, the sort of updated Title IX stuff. And we had a regular board meeting coming up, and we had just sort of finalized the language. So we were happy to take that as first reading, and then we had another regular meeting and took that as second reading. So Easton is, that's on the books for Easton. And that was a situation where it was advantageous for us to act, alone and not wait for everybody else to be able to meet. Yeah.
So my understanding was that you have committee members, and then I thought past practice was committee members would go back and report to their boards on the work of the committee. And you could ask questions and have some discussion at your individual board meeting. If there was, some confusion or some, more clarification you were seeking, you could give that to the board representative that's on your board. And then they would go back and they would have their committee discussions. But then you would have a presentation, a discussion overall from the committee to the three boards at the joint meeting, rather than no discussion from any of the reps, and you just hear it for the first time at the tri-board meeting as, here's the committee presentation, please vote on it. So I don't know whether we're suggesting changing it, but that was my understanding of the way
I don't think so.
No, I don't think we're recommending a change there. I think you're right, Mike, and that actually has been what sort of the process that we follow on sort of joint committees that I'm a part of. Whenever we have something to share, I share it inside of other regular meetings.
Get the rest of the board's input to take back into the committee. Yeah, I think what you described is the way. I think we're all doing it right now. That's documenting it again would be good.
Yeah,
that's different than saying the joint committee met and has recommended entering into a contract with XYZ. Let's vote on it now.
Right.
It's here's an interim update as to what's going on, so you can be apprised, which I think is completely appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Okay.
I have
Great.
a question about that though. If at a board meeting, one board wants to act on a committee recommendation and the other two don't, or vice versa, can that one board go ahead and do it if it's not something that requires all three boards' participation? Or, I mean, this is ultimately like the
Depends.
the
Yeah, it
question
depends.
that we.
I think it depends on the topic, but I also think that I think the larger question about, when do we need consensus and when do we not need consensus? And if we do need consensus, are there any situations where we allow for some kind of mechanism or some kind of, we'll get to that. But I think that I think we all anticipate that that's going to be a really sort of controversial topic. I don't actually think it needs to be controversial. I think we have some ideas and we're going to talk about it. And I think we'll figure it out as we go.
Great.
And you could process map it.
Yeah,
you could say,
that's right.
if yes, then this way, if no,
That's right.
that way.
That's right.
I think that was the whole point of a lot of this work, was to do exactly that, Colleen, to sort of process map us so that we don't fall back on what next all the time.
Right. So I would say if anyone has, any scope items that we're missing, we continue to meet on Friday mornings. We have several meetings ahead of our May 25th. And, we will plan to continue to do the work on this to make sure that we're documenting the way that it has been done to the best of our understanding.
Yeah, John, sorry to interrupt, but the other one is probably central office budget, right? Because we have had a mechanism there where the boards, I don't know if that falls in one of these others.
We're going to get there. We got
3 topics. That'll be
next slide.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay.
We'll get there. We'll get there. And,
all right, well, as it matters impacting central office, I didn't know if central office budget was part of that.
Well, absolutely. So I just want to encourage anyone who has ideas about, hey, here's another thing that you didn't touch on that we should probably document. Like, don't hesitate to, either join one of our Friday meetings and suggest it there, or send us a heads up and we can add it. Okay. So in terms of matters impacting central office and personnel, establish a standard operating procedure for the oversight of central office jointly managed personnel and the approval of a budget. Again, 6 items here. That's coincidence, not design, but review and approval and reopening of the central office budget. What is that process? What should it be? And being very clear about that, and that could be thorny, right? We recognize that. Onboarding of senior central office personnel, approval of salary benefits for senior central office personnel, lease agreements, strategic goal setting and long-term planning for central office, and superintendent evaluations. On any one of these, and on anything in this document, if we say the process is everybody does their own thing, okay, let's just write that down, right? But I think as we look through each one of these, we see there are definitely items that are on this list that sort of require some kind of collaboration and discussion. So first, any reactions, anything anybody has, to the items that are on this list, or anything that's not on this list that maybe should be?
I think superintendent evaluation should not be on this list.
And so your opinion is that the superintendent evaluation should be a totally different process in each district?
No, I think statutorily each district has to do a superintendent evaluation at least once yearly. So each district has to do an evaluation. Again, that's just my opinion. I don't know why it would be a tri-board thing unless you're going to try and incorporate a consensus or form a unified evaluate. I don't know where it fits in there. I think those are functions of each board. I think it's going to be very complicated to do it in any way as part of the tri-board system.
Amazingly, I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, I think I do too. The one place where I would say it's worth discussing, so document the way it's been done in the past, which is 3 completely separate processes.
Okay.
I think it's worth discussing. Are you guys using a rubric, or are we a rubric? Are we using a rubric? Or like, what is your process? Understanding, and maybe even saying, hey, we'll share with you how we plan to evaluate. That doesn't mean that we're going to take your input on how we're going to evaluate in any way, but that could be a good best practice. So we know, oh, you're going to look at this. We didn't even think about evaluating the superintendent on that dimension. We might do that as well. And then as we are able to look at, does it make sense for us to compare notes after that evaluation? Because ultimately it is useful for us to talk together about, hey, here's what we think of the superintendent. Here's what you're thinking of the superintendent, and understanding whether or not we're on the same page.
I mean, there is some risk in having 3 superintendent evaluations in silos,
right? Including
one board says the superintendent should be doing more of this, and the other board says the superintendent should be doing less of exactly the same thing. And it's still one person. The extent to which the process is largely the 3 boards set their own process is one thing, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're still talking about one human being.
I think you also have to be cognizant of the fact that the timelines for these evaluations can affect what the evaluations actually say, right? A particular person under a particular set of extreme stress may be evaluated one way. And if there's a consensus around timelines for the work, that can be documented as part of this process too.
Yeah, and I again, we're not trying to beat anybody over the head and say, you see, so we should change the way we've been doing it. That's not the point here. But if we document the way that we've been doing it, that can also be helpful for us to say, okay, are there other things that we want to do in addition to that? Or is everybody happy and frankly not sort of open to doing more work there? So
I think it's a critical function. I think it has to be written down. I have worked for multiple bosses, and that it's from a personnel point of view, it's a mess trying to please. So I could make a whole case about what we should do, but that aside, what we do must be written down.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Yep. Okay. I think we've actually already done a very good job of documenting the onboarding of senior central office personnel. I think there's certainly still work that can be done there. And we're saying onboarding, but I think what we really mean is the hiring process, right? So onboarding actually, I think, means something different. Onboarding,
Yes.
in my mind,
It
is
should be
actually
hiring. Yeah,
Yeah.
hiring or something.
After they're hired.
Yep.
I'm happy to give them badges and all that kind of stuff if we want.
They're not in the budget. They're not in the budget. They're not in the budget.
Okay. But yeah, so the process of hiring senior central office personnel, I think we did a good job of creating a sort of framework, but it certainly could always use more attention and make sure that we get feedback on that over time. Anything, I mean, like we don't need to make this a 10-hour long meeting. I really, more than anything else, I want to make sure that people understand sort of the work that we're trying to do and give people an opportunity to tell us, hey, you're missing this, or you're thinking about this wrong.
So what is your vision for the end of this? Are you looking to have the boards vote to approve something like this, or you're just documenting it? Because again, even like with the hiring things that we discussed and everything, we just basically made some outlines with some suggestions. They've never been voted on by the boards or anything. There's stuff that can change. We're just kind of documenting guidelines for posterity that you have it there. Is that what we're looking for here? Or are you looking to do some sort of formal document?
I think at a minimum it's that, right? At a minimum, it's documenting the stuff for posterity. And I think on the other side, I don't think it's actually that far from that. On the other side, it may be some, like Chris puts it, as an MOA between the three boards, some kind of, hey, we vote individually as three boards and we say this reflects our intent to sort of operate in this way. And there's how binding that is, I think is in question. I think it's probably not very binding, but it's having some kind of vote on that, I could imagine. But at a minimum, if we have the process down, I think that's a benefit.
It would be tough to impact the ability of future boards. I don't know whether you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what bylaws are, really. So I tend to agree with you.
Could do that.
Yeah, it is possible
to do that by the bylaws.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Right, but not this document. This whatever, if we called it an MOA.
MOA.
I agree. One step at a time here.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Anything else on this one before we move on to the last item? Okay, good. So the last item is methods for reaching consensus. And this is us doing our best to document both sort of what we think has been used in the past, as well as sort of other logical ideas that we could conceive of. So I'll start by saying, this is all about documenting the procedural options available to the boards in order to reach a consensus when the boards are not in agreement. We imagine there could be different levels of importance with a disagreement. So procedural things like adding an agenda item or recessing or moving to executive session, that's one thing. Hiring senior personnel is another thing in terms of the weight of sort of those decisions. Now, it's reasonable to say if you have disagreement about whether or not you should recess, you might have disagreement about whether or not you consider that to be procedural or substantive. And so it's reasonable to say, if that's a part of the disagreements, would you say that might it make sense to say, yes, we have a chair who follows this annual rotation, but could there also be some kind of parliamentarian who is selected at the beginning of a session to say, this person is going to help us to determine whether or not something is in fact procedural or substantive. If it falls inside of that procedural category, it is possible you can elevate it, to table a motion and say, no, that's substantive. It requires a more meaningful approval of all three boards versus a simple majority or a supermajority or whatever. So I'm just trying to lay the sort of foundation for, it's possible that the answer is there is no process. that no matter what, even on something as simple as recessing or tabling a motion or adding an agenda item, if we don't have 3 out of 3 boards agreeing, there is no process for agreement. If that's the answer, that's the answer. Let's write it down.
Well,
If on the other, sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, we're making an assumption we have to get to consensus, and I don't think that's accurate, except for in a central office budget where we all have to approve a budget. After that, for any of these other items that we just went through, we don't have to come to a consensus. If any board doesn't like it, they don't have to be part of it. So why do we have to come to consensus on every matter? I think we should define which matters we need consensus on. Central office budget, and then what's the mechanism to do that?
Well, certainly you need consensus on the things that John just sort of identified as procedural, just because if you're going to function as 3 separate boards in one meeting, you need some level of efficiency, right? And you need some playbook to fall back at to say, this is our procedure if we fail. So I somewhat disagree with you. What do we actually need consensus about? If we believe we only need consensus about a central office budget, then we say that. And we say that. That's it. I think we need procedural consensus before we even get there. But
can I suggest also that it's not just a question of what we absolutely need. You could define that. But I thought part of the goal here was to establish, more effective and efficient ways of working together, because
absolutely,
that's what we want to do. It's not because we need to, it's not because we're statutorily required to, it's that we want to move things forward. And what we don't want to do is, what I wouldn't want to do is get into a half-hour argument about whether we should all go into the same executive session or not.
Right.
That would be an example. Now, do we need to? No. But wouldn't the world be a better place if we did? I think so.
But what is good governance? Good governance is a set of rules to keep people engaging with one another in a civil and reasonable way. And that's what we're trying to do.
To move forward,
To move forward,
to reach a decision.
I'll wait and see, but and the second item, using the mechanism, right, and overriding the other 2 boards on certain items, I don't think is necessary.
So, and that's
okay with having a consensus item and a way to get there on certain items, but again, I don't think that's necessary for every item that we've had on those previous 2 pages.
Yeah, and I would be really interested in getting the sense from anybody, like where do we think the mechanism is appropriately applied, or is it never appropriately applied? Do we reject it outright, or do we think no, this circumstance specifically, it can be and should be applied?
Could you define
when has it been
what
used
you mean
before?
by mechanism?
Sure. So the mechanism,
process
2D.
2.
So I tried to define it as concisely as possible. Essentially, a motion carries 2 of 3 boards in 3 successive tests.
Okay.
That's
the traditional mechanism.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Which we are writing down.
Okay.
When has that been used in the past?
Few times.
A few times. Central office
On what
budget.
issues?
Yeah,
Central
Only on
office
central
budget.
budget. It only pertains to central office.
Right, so let me jump in here because Colleen was good enough to look at minutes going back to 2003 on this issue. And the mechanism was used for, among other things, agreeing to post board documents on the internet. 2 boards were for, 1 was against, they voted 3 times, and that's why documents got put on the internet. There was something about switching from a month-to-month contract with Alan Fossbender. That was approved by 2 boards over 1. There was tabling central office budget discussions that was approved by the mechanism, and that I think is purely a procedural issue. There was approval of consultant fees in 2011 that was approved by the mechanism. There was a salary increase for a central office administrator that was approved by a mechanism in a June meeting that has nothing to do with the central office budget. So it has not historically been strictly limited to central office, which I think is part of the sort of core of this work in documenting process, so that it doesn't become a combination of sort of historical memory of different board members and word of mouth. and we have a sort of clear idea of what is and isn't.
But you realize there's no such thing as the mechanism. It's something, it's a gentleman's agreement, and probably a bad word. It's a mutual agreement amongst the boards as a way of breaking a deadlock that can be used at the discretions, of the boards. But there's the mechanism is not binding. If one board says, we don't care about your mechanism, we're not approving this budget, it doesn't get approved. I kind of feel like we're trying to, what we're doing here is there was an unfortunate incident that we could go into and clearly define as to what actually happened, as to why one board was not in favor of the ramming through that the other two boards were in favor of. And so there was a little pushback. And so there was a feeling by some of the boards that this was what we had to do, and one board did not agree. So there was a little bit of a stalemate. We had some disagreement, but if you think about it, it actually worked itself out eventually anyways, okay, by finding common ground and getting all boards on, getting all three boards to reach a consensus. I think that, trying to stipulate when the mechanism will be used and when it will not be used, you can certainly do that, but none of it is binding. I mean, we are three separate boards. I kind of I feel like we always do have the best interests of the district and our students and our communities, at hand. That's what we always do that. And it always seems to work out. This whole thing about trying to make it so smooth, we're going down the bumpy road to try and make it a smooth road for, the 2 or 3 times in the last 10 years when the road's been bumpy. And I think that's kind of a fool's errand. But
first of all, it is in the best interests of the students in the 3 districts and the 3 boards to have an efficient way of working. And I think to Chris Hocker's point, that's exactly what this work is about, is finding that common ground and efficiency to document processes and reduce friction and be more efficient for our board members and our administrators present and future. And I would also take issue with the suggestion that this was born out of an issue in the fall, which it was not. This has been discussed for much longer.
Well, it's come up 3 times already, and we've only been meeting for a little while. So.
You know what? And that all
seems
speaks
like it's the root.
to me, Mike. That all speaks to why we need to do this work, right?
Exactly.
Well, I'm just saying it seems to have come up a few times, so it seems like that's the root.
And that's why we're here.
I will say, apologies for being late. I will say I agree with Maureen. I don't think that this stems from 1 or 2 issues. I mean, and I can only speak for the last 3.5 years. For me, this is not about one example necessitating some kind of solution. This is indicative. This is needed. If nothing else, it's just rules, not codified rules, but rules or practices of engagement, so that we don't have to rely on people's selective, albeit well-intended memories on how things happened in the past. And it's a reference document, if nothing else. If we don't codify anything or change a policy and we don't have to change bylaws, this is kind of just to establish the ground rules so that we can work better together. We all do have, I do agree with what a lot of people have said, we have the best interest at heart of our students. This is just a better way to get to it. I mean, short of, quite frankly, regionalization, which that's even harder to do than this. So, but we don't need to have and we have had this over the last 2.5 years, half-an-hour discussions on how we vote because of the motions, because we're 3 separate boards. This will help us hopefully alleviate that inefficiency.
Yeah, that's right. It is about that. And I would also say, I'm not trying to pile on here, Mike, and I agree with a lot of what you say.
Not piling on me, I'm fine.
Okay, good. So I do want to say it's also a function of our central office administrators. I want them to have gas in the tank to do strategic thinking. I want them to feel like they have the energy for that. And when they sit through a 30-minute debate about how we're going to, whether or not we're going to make a motion, whether or not we're going to, that's really painful. So if we can just have a clear understanding of here's what the process should be, and it's 3 minutes, not 30 minutes, then that lets them have a little bit more energy ready for doing the more important work that benefits our students.
I think to that end, I think that the mechanism, whatever you want to say, or that a 2/3 majority can make a decision in terms of procedural issues, I think is entirely appropriate, because that just is addressing our way of working and efficiency. So, if we want to enter into an executive session, in the executive session, if you didn't want to be there, you can say whatever it is that you want. But just to move things along so that it's not like, as we were talking about, a 40-minute discussion over whether or not we're going to do that.
The problem I see is that sometimes when people get into longer discussions, positions become entrenched and people become really vested in a particular outcome. And procedure eliminates that, right? You're going to be able to say, but the procedure is this, move along. But the procedure is this.
Not only that, to Cheryl's point, where, what I've seen, not just recently, is, the tendency is to rely on the memory of the people who have been around relatively longer.
Like you, Mr. Hacker?
That, like me. And that's kind of the point. You shouldn't have to do that, particularly when you have two different recollections and two different definitions of what our past practice has been, which could well be just perfectly, understandable differences in our respected memories. But geez, that's no way to operate.
And
Also,
come December, there could be as
because
many as
you've
10
done something-
out of 21 new board members.
Yeah.
And it's fair to them to be able to walk in and say, oh, this is how it works, and not have to rely on.
Or at least this is how it has worked, so you don't get into a side conversation saying, well, no, it worked this way then, and yeah.
Right.
But I think beyond just understanding how it has been done in the past, it has not necessarily been done with the greatest of efficiency in the past, whatever decision we're talking about. So this is also an opportunity to say, what's the best way forward, regardless of how it was done in the past? And to me, having a 2/3 majority decide on procedural issues makes life easier. And there's no, I don't see any downside to that.
And understand, we as a committee are not vested in that outcome yet. We are not necessarily recommending that yet, although that could be the way we ultimately decide. That's not the purpose of this conversation.
Right.
The
That's
purpose of this conversation is to divide things into procedural and substantive things, and then decide how we want to treat each of those things and where we would dead end if we dead end anywhere.
Right. Okay. So obviously there's a lot here. And probably many more conversations to have. We hope to have some significant progress by May 25th to talk about, but we understand if the three major categories that we've touched on here, we only get to some of it. I think we will intend to time box any conversation we have on May 25th. Yes, Chris.
John, I just wanted to make a comment, thinking about something that Todd said earlier about consensus and do we really need consensus? And I think that to a certain extent, if you're reading consensus as positive action, as opposed to negative or non-action, then it means something slightly different. And I think that might be how Todd is hearing it, of this is how we sort of ram things through or make sure that stuff happens. And consensus can just as well be, we disagree with something and the decision is non-action. And so when we say consensus, to a certain extent, we're getting to how do we resolve a question and how do we bottom out?
It's resolution. It's not consensus.
Right.
It's resolution. Yeah.
It's ending a discussion basically in a way that everybody understands that it's over, as opposed to leaving a meeting and saying, well, this board is holding out, so I'm going to have to go twist arms about this board. This is when the issue is dead. And when can it be revived and how can it be revived and things like that is a separate question. But I think consensus is a little bit of a tricky word. Yeah. And I think I realized that based on what Todd's comments were.
That's very good. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm in agreement on the procedural. I would want to understand more on the substantive and item C as well, because I don't think any board should be bound by the other two boards in majority through anything financial that would impact their budgets and things like that without that board having a say in it. I mean, they were elected, by the townspeople and making decisions for their district, and they shouldn't be overridden by the other two boards by supermajority on some items in the substantive. In the procedural, to add an agenda item, we shouldn't spend a half hour figuring that out. Let's use a mechanism and add an agenda item.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, ultimately, it's I'm just trying to sort of make progress so that we can document this stuff. But Todd, everything you said, I agree with.
Not to overcomplicate this, and apologies if this was discussed earlier, from a legal perspective, the fact that legally there are 3 different districts, would there be anything? I guess maybe that would be step 2, right? Once we get through resolution, whatever we want to call it, then we would have to have external counsel look at this to see if what we're procedurally writing would be counter to what our individual bylaws say.
I think it's a memorandum of understanding. I think that would be a good practice, but I don't think anyone would find that our work is invalid because we're not changing bylaws. We're just sort of saying, hey, this is our meeting governance book.
Okay, thanks.
Can I sort of elaborate on the famous mechanism, which we may decide we don't want to do the mechanism.
And we want to rename it, okay? Can we rename it, please?
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah. When I first went on the board, in 1897, we had sort of a dispute, and the people who had been there for a long time, they were almost gleeful about, boy, now we can invoke the mechanism. It's like something out of Star Trek or something. So, but the point is that when I've seen the mechanism used, it's often a sort of rote, vote once, vote twice, vote a third time, then it's done, which is fine. But my belief, although I can't back this up, is that the point of having that mechanism is that in between votes, you can have a rational discussion and maybe change people's minds or end up in a different place.
Right.
So I point that out just because otherwise it's kind of stupid, 1, 2, 3, and you're done, even though I've seen it happen that way. I just point that out.
When I was reading the minutes, there were a few minutes that indicated that there was a thorough and in-depth conversation in between each vote, because sometimes we're having meetings in public, right? And it is if possible to reach agreement, not consensus, true agreement, it can be a very powerful thing. So they were trying to do that.
Right. I think that was the intent of the mechanism, but again, I can't prove that because the mechanism goes back even before my time.
Yeah, I've seen the mechanism used, and I think some of the ways, because I agree with Chris, what they used to say is it would caucus in between votes. But where that gets a little wonky is when you have members of different political parties that are having private discussions aside from the public discussion, that's not really allowed. So
that's not a caucus.
But I have seen that. I remember one at John Reed Middle School where the boards went separately off on their own to argue amongst themselves and then come back, which is totally not good. But I feel like I'm all on board for documenting the processes. And I feel like if you do that, you can avoid, because I think we're going to get mired in this whole when the mechanism, not the mechanism, supermajority, all this other stuff. The root of the issue really is the process leading up to the issue that forms that you need the mechanism. If you resolve that and you can figure out how to do that in a collaborative way, you will avoid having the pitfalls of the mechanism all the time. There are going to be certain situations where central office, as has happened in the past, where the budget is in a spot where it affects the individual boards budget number to a degree that certain members are not happy. And you're always going to have some, a chance that there's disagreement among that number, even though we're all, again, have the best interest of the districts at heart. But these other issues, again, I feel like they can be resolved if you just fix the processes building up to them, rather than worrying about what happens if we get to that point. How can we resolve it or come to consensus, however you want to frame it? It really doesn't matter. But I think it's always problematic if you're going to have two overrule one. It's much better to get there where what is the one objecting to, and how can we resolve it in a way that we can be three together rather than two against one. And I think, yeah, it's difficult. It's challenging. We can make it about, administrative time, and we don't support them because we're arguing, but it's really not about that. I mean, we all support the administration. They all should know that. There's going to be certain times when we disagree. And I think it's all about putting your big boy pants on, not big person pants on, and figuring out how to find that, common ground so that you can, again, all agree. And I don't think it's as big an issue as we're making it. I think there were process issues leading up to the last, challenging situation that we had. And I'm sure they have in the past. And I'm sure there are other ones that you can do everything the right way and you're still going to disagree. But we are still three separate boards. But if we all agree that we all have the best interests of the district at heart, we will find common ground. I don't think it does any good to do this.
So Mike, something that I think is sort of a little bit in the weeds from here, but as part of this process, and it keeps in mind the fact that getting the three boards together is sort of a Herculean task in the first instance, which is why we only do it 3 times a year or in sort of exigent circumstances. And one of the areas in which I think we can build consensus and avoid inefficient use of time is around saying the central office budget is part of our core function as a tri-board. So let's codify or agree that the October meeting shall include at a minimum drivers for the next year's central office budget, a review of the prior year's actuals in central office, an expectation that the January meeting is when we approve the central office budget, but a further expectation that those numbers be distributed to everybody at least 7 days in advance, things of that nature, so that when we get to the January meeting, there isn't hemming and hawing about, well, I only got this 3 hours ago, and now we have an argument about whether or not we need to come back in 2 weeks and things like that. If we just put it all down into a calendar and all down into a process, it sounds tedious and pointless, but it will solve for a lot of issues going forward. And that's all part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I'm all on board for that. Like I said, documenting it, the process. In fact, I remember when there was not an October meeting. The October meeting was added for the very purpose that you stated, was to give, some awareness of the budget, rather than coming in January when you have to decide, in 2 hours, here's the budget. It was to give us a little heads up and to kind of initiate that discussion between the individual boards leading up to that, and communications through the board chairs back to the superintendent. That was the whole, genesis of that October meeting. So I think documenting this, putting account, all this stuff is good stuff, that can avoid these challenging dilemmas that we find ourselves in from time to time. But I just think that's much more useful and constructive than arguing about whether we resolve this with 2/3 majority or we resolve this one with the because, like I say, the mechanism is really not real. It's something that we do because we want to find a resolution at a certain point. And we understand that at some point you have to have a central office budget. If if one board is against it, at some point you have to have one, which is why, you have to do something to, to resolve that. But I'm not sure it's that way with all these others. And I'm not sure that it creates challenging and tenuous situations in tri-board meetings unless, the process leading up.
If I could answer that a little bit. That's the whole point of defining what is and isn't is because if you have no definition of any sort of, what matters and what doesn't, then theoretically anything could be the subject of a disagreement. And I think that's what this committee is trying to do is, in that last slide, John, that is simply trying to say, okay, this is important stuff. This is not so important stuff. And when push comes to shove on really important stuff, and to bounce off what's been said already, I mean, if there's anything that's at least as bad as having two boards sort of force their opinion on the one board, it's the reverse, where there's no way to prevent what's effectively a veto, and that's what ultimately needs to be resolved.
Yeah. So documenting it as best we can, and getting it to the point where we can review it and say, yes, that is an accurate reflection of either what has happened in the past or what we believe should be the process going forward. And if there are items sort of in this presentation or any other items that we come up with over time that we say we don't agree on what the answer is to that, that's fine. Let's document that as well. And that can also be instructive, because as we come into a conversation, if some people within the 24 members are thinking, oh, we have a way through this, if we really need to, we can invoke the mechanism. And some people are saying there is no possible way that anyone could get us off of this point of view, when we don't even have a shared understanding about what the rules are. And we're coming into this into this place in a way that there's unlikely to be any kind of resolution. So at least for us to say.
It's only 21, Jim, not 24.
Did I say 24?
Don't make it any tougher.
I literally like imagined the number 21 in my head when I said it, and then I said 24.
Why don't we make it 27?
That would say it is time for me to sign off. Wow. Okay. So we got to find 3 more board members. That's all.
Please.
All right. Sorry about that. Very good. Any additional conversation on this? Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate sort of the number of people who showed up and sort of participated in the conversation. I think it's really helpful. If there's nothing else, we'll go to public comment. Okay. Hearing none. Committee member comment?
Just to echo your comments, John, and thanks, folks, for the thoughtful commentary tonight.
Very good. Entertain a motion.
And to note that we'll be back at it at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Anyone who wishes to join is welcome.
Entertain a motion to adjourn.
Oh, so moved.
I need it from Maureen or Chris.
Oh,
moved.
sorry. Because on this committee. My bad.
You're right about
Maureen,
So
Second.
Chris, thank you. All in favor. Maureen, thank you.
I did.
Adjourned at 8:08 p.m. All right.
Thank
thanks,
you for
everybody.
your work, everybody.
Thank
It was
you, John.
great.
Thank you, everybody.